Hello and welcome back, and that is right, we're continuing looking at Asustor NAS and helping you set it up right the very first time. And today we're talking about security. Let's face it, these systems for most users are going to be on 24/7, and with that in mind, you're going to want to know you've got security in place. It's not just a question of putting a lock on the door. You want to triple lock it, you want several locks, you want reinforced windows, you want about 8 doors between the outside world and you, and that's what this video is about. But a quick disclaimer out the gate, this is going to be about reinforcing the system, arguably via the local area network, via connected client users, connected client devices, and the system itself. In part 7, we're going to be looking at external access, setting up your DDNS, making sure your firewall is robust as all hell, DOS, denial of service attack protection, of course, going down the road of VPNs and more, and of course adding encrypted certificates to your system to make it a more robust system to withstand external attack points. But it's such a big subject, we've had to break it down into these 2 videos because some of you don't want to use any kind of external access whatsoever, and you just want to double down on the local access there and double down on the security of that access. So with that in mind, let's face it, some of you may be coming to this video because of vulnerabilities. Let's face it, when Asustor were hit by the Deadbolt ransomware attack, that was, to say the least, disheartening. They weren't the only ones. TerraMaster and QNAP were hit as well, and they did respond. They did work with a lot of users to protect their systems, but the vulnerabilities that were exploited were not all just about the vulnerabilities that were found in certain apps and services of ADM, but also because of updates not being installed by users and insecure setups that people were using on their systems and leaving them on for days, weeks, months at a time. And that's what this video is hopefully going to resolve. Now, before we go any further, there's a few fundamentals that are going to be incredibly important to most users. Number one, and it's something you're going to hear about all the time, so we've got to get the obvious one out of the way. It is to do with using two-factor authentication, two-step authentication, ultimately adding another layer of authentication to access. You've got your login name, you've got your password, but this has to then utilize OTP or 2FA services like Google Authenticator that once you enable them, and again it's easy to enable, select two-factor authentication, scan the barcode there on screen to install the app, and then you can utilize that authenticator by clicking next, scan and enter the code, and then from there, once you scan that code, it'll allow you to create that refreshing every 30-60 seconds 6-digit code that will require an additional layer of secure access to the NAS for those users, and that is regardless of whether those users have got the lowest level multimedia access or full power user status there. Now on top of that, it's worth highlighting another app, Dr. Asustor. Dr. Asustor is their diagnostics tool that scans the system and checks the state of play within the system to do with file services you may have open and other areas of, say, backup security and backup integrity. Again, we talked about those in other videos there. They do highlight installing the antivirus software there and having scheduled scans of the data inside. I do think we should take a quick moment to talk about the nature of vulnerabilities. You know, upwards of a decade ago, there was obviously concerns around in the world of NAS, viruses and malware. And these two are, of course, still prevalent today. But when it comes to network-attached storage, these have taken something of a back seat because they're still around. But because the nature of those was to lower a system's ability to work or completely undermine the system and break it, these have given way to ransomware. Ransomware, at its basic level, is just trying to utilize, in many cases, malware or viruses or exploited vulnerabilities within software platforms to inject a line of code. That is it. It's not trying to pull your data away. It's not trying to delete your data. It just wants to inject a line of code. That injected line of code is going to get into your system, and the first thing it's going to do is get as much data as it can zipped up, .rar, .zip, .whatever, to basically zip it all up into an archive. Then from there, delete any password that it creates, and then leave a tiny little ransom note, a document, a rich text format document, a docx, Word doc, whatever, saying, we've encrypted your data, send us this much Bitcoin to this web address and we'll give you the key. That's how it goes down. And ransomware, unfortunately, has become incredibly lucrative by dodgy individuals online. So again, as good as it is that it's making recommendations towards antivirus and malware, which are important because you may be uploading compromised files to the system that might have an ability to work natively within ADM, although it's pretty unlikely, it's more important to protect against ransomware more than anything else. Now, while this scanning is taking place here in the background, let's talk a little bit about the other area that you have to go down to, notifications. Because if your system has been compromised, if a patch is desperately needed on your system, or if your system is being brute force attempted to be broken into, you need to know. And the first thing you need to do there is to go into the settings menu and make sure you have set up some form of push notification or direct to email or your mobile phone. Again, they seem a little bit much, I know, but even if you use the Asustor AI Master app, the NAS management tool, that is enough to get those notifications pushed to your system to alert you if you are being brute force hacked, if your IP is being externally or internally hit. You could have a system that is completely offline but on network. But that just means that a connected user on a phone or a tablet, if their system becomes compromised because they didn't install the latest Windows, Android, iOS or Mac update and they've become compromised, that system could in itself be looking for media servers, looking for SMB media servers, looking for standard file servers of any kind and just trying to get in. Now, I think it would be reasonably fair to say that the majority of vulnerabilities that have been found in the world of NAS from most brands, and that includes Synology with Synolocker back in 2013-14, all the way through to QSnatch and Deadbolt and QLocker and all these other ones, all of these came from vulnerabilities that were found. Asustor has its own security pages where you can get alerts to vulnerabilities that may have been found, but also a lot of those vulnerabilities can be tied down to two areas when they are found: ADM itself or individual applications and services. Now, those in themselves, that is not a, I'm not going to say not a crime, but I'm not going to say it's a surprise. Whether you are Google, Apple, Google Chrome, whether you are the most low-level internet created service, you can only ever be one step ahead of hackers. And most NAS software is built on Linux, different kernels of Linux, and every time Linux releases a new version, hackers, black hat hackers, are trying their best to break it, to find a vulnerability, because they know there's so many, there's hundreds, thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of pieces of software around the world that is used every day, built on Linux, that if they find a vulnerability within a specific version of Linux, they know they could attempt to exploit it on the software that's built on top of it for profit. Now, as great as it would be for ADM or any other NAS brand to constantly update their Linux kernel to the latest or safest version, it's a big undertaking. Linux just needs to update its tool set and its base level sandbox grounding. Every bit of app and services that's built on that and utilizing Linux therefore has to tailor it to their own setup. It is not that straightforward or that easy or that quick to implement the fixes. So there's a window of opportunity there. And when a vulnerability is found, the longer Linux, the platform doesn't know about it, the even longer it will be and the easier it can be exploited. Hence how things like Deadbolt occurred there. So it's really important to do one of two things. Number one, make sure in the App Center that here in the management menu that updates are installed all the time. Make sure if there is an app that you've downloaded and an update becomes available that you action it. Don't let it sit there not patched. Asustor has a lot of first-party apps, but it also has a lot of third-party apps, and it's not Asus's responsibility to maintain the apps as much as those third-party ones release their own updated version, much like we talked about in our Plex video, where they will release a new version of their software, submit it to Asustor, and if they don't submit it to Asustor, Asustor really needs their input to be able to install those updates and get the most latest revision with those security updates. So just make sure they are installed automatically every time. You can action them manually, as you can see here with Plex Media Server. A new version has been supplied since our previous video where we did the Plex Media Server testing. But it's really important that the individual app updates are installed automatically. And moreover, it's even better to know that yes, you are going to have to restart that app, but at the very least you haven't got to restart your system. However, that's a different story when you need to install a full ADM update. That is the operating system, and it's really important again that when ADM, a new version, is available, that you automatically install it. I know it's a bore lake. You might have virtual machines or surveillance running. You might be in the middle of a movie, but it's really important that you let those updates automatically trigger, because that is another way why Deadbolt happened as much as it did across all the different brands, because there were users that had set up their device for the first time, didn't allow auto updates, and hadn't had a security fix update for years on end. And vulnerabilities all too often are found in older versions of Linux rather than the newer ones, because more time has been made available to find those vulnerabilities. And also on top of that, generally legacy vulnerabilities. Once a vulnerability is found, don't be surprised if it applies to every older version of Linux that came before it, because of that legacy nature of Linux. So auto-update your apps and auto-update ADM, even if it is a pain in the arse that it has to restart. Also, and this harks back to part 2 in this video series, if you've got multiple users, make sure that not only do they have that two-factor authentication we've discussed, but also make sure the level of control, access, input, and arguably change they can afford to your system is as low as possible and only scoped as high as necessary. What you don't want, again, is their system to be compromised and all of a sudden you've handed the keys to the kingdom to someone that didn't know how to close down an app in Android easily. So make sure when you're going through your users to edit the level of access and security they have accordingly. If you are concerned, make sure, for example, that the access they have to certain important areas of storage is read only if it concerns you, because that means they can't edit those files, even if they try to introduce some of that injected code to try and zip that data up. They won't be able to affect the original copies and delete it. Even if they manage to create an archival version of that data, they won't be able to delete the originals. And the same goes with that shared folder when you create your shared folder, to use write once, read many when creating it, or worm, as that will ensure that the data cannot be destroyed at all, or indeed easily there. And you can go ahead within the access controls to filter these people into groups that have overarching access as well, so you can create a sub-user group that has zero real power to do anything. And again, it's disabled by default, but it's worth touching on once again that the admin account and the guest account are always off and always deactivated when ADM is installed. If you ever enable them because you need to have root access for something like SSH or worse, disable them straight away. And while we're talking about SSH, we should really touch on why you need to disable things like SSH, why you need to disable remote level access. Now again, most of them are disabled by default, and indeed with the exception of SMB, which is quite a day-to-day service that most users kind of need by default, although you can enforce the security protection there in the background to make sure that anything, even low-level SMB, requires authentication to get in. You can still disable by default every other service. Disable all of them, not just SSH, but anything. Whether if you're not a Mac user, disable AFP. It should be disabled by default, but double check all of these are off. Rsync server. If you are backing up NAS to NAS and you're using real-time remote replication, RTRR or rsync, you may need it. But if you don't, untick that box. Go through and apply all of those options and make them appropriate to your setup, and ensure that you have bolted down all of the hatches, all of the windows as much as you can. And finally, default ports. It's understandable, a lot of users aren't really aware of this up until recently, and to Asustor's credit, Asustor and ADM, when you do the fresh installation, actually forces you to have to go through this. But having ports at default 8000 and 8001 these days will not cut it. These are the default ports the system boots up with, but unfortunately, with the exception of, I think, perhaps Synology, who use port 5000 and 5001, nearly everyone else uses 8000 or 8080 on a non-secured port there, using HTTP access there. Now, change that port. Now, I am still currently going through the setup series for NAS Compares. I'm going through all of the steps, going through 8 to 9 to 10 videos for each brand, and unfortunately I've got to a point where I've bridged all these services on that because it's all local access here, and for the ease of recording, leaving it at 8,000 just makes sense. But for you, it should not. Make sure you change this port during that first installation. Otherwise, later on when you build everything upon it, that port is going to be problematic and things will not work. Change it at the beginning, and therefore, later on, as you add more and more services, you won't have to go back in and troubleshoot. But also, not having a default well-known access port there will result in closing another avenue, another area of access that, if a potential vulnerability is found, will allow that level of control and input into your system. And finally, we can move over to ADM Defender. And ADM Defender does one of two very important things for the majority of users who are worried about either locally compromised systems having access, or someone introduced into a new IP. So someone comes into your building for work, they are then given the Wi-Fi code, so now they are on the LAN. Now this is about blocking those users because maybe they've already arrived with known credentials to try to get in. They've got the login credentials. Hell, they may have stolen a phone that has got that authentication. But, and this is important, if they're not using a trusted device, or you're on an IP that you have not fixed and allowed to be trusted, they still won't get in. So for example, you can go ahead and manually select a very specific IP address or an IP range. That will allow you to ensure that, for example, if you've created a VLAN, which can be a network within a network, but a virtual network, these IPs that people can be physically bonded to using a sophisticated router or switch, they can get in. But if they are not on one of those preset IPs, you can auto block them. You can also add grey lists that allow risk detection and investigation, or auto blacklists, which will automatically assume that a non-listed IP, it goes straight to the back of the queue or doesn't get in at all without system admin via the notification allowing it and going in and giving that entrance point there. There's a lot of different options there open to you. It's not just black and white. As you can see literally there on screen, there are lots of other options that allow you to control who can get in and who, more importantly, who can not get in. And on a very basic level, moving away from every other security tool we've talked about thus far, if you are someone that is concerned about your system being on 24/7, you've set up all your notifications and alerts, you've set up your auto-blocked IP, you've IP logs there, you've set up all of these credentials, all of these layers of security, but you are worried that an impacted brute force hack is going to happen while you're asleep and you're going to sleep through those notifications, there is another thing you can do. Head into the hardware tab, and in the power tab, you can set up scheduled on and off. So you can set it up that every single day on a different schedule, you can have the system turning on at a given time, say 8 AM while you're having your cornflakes, and then in the evening, 6 to 8 PM perhaps, when you know you're not going to be using, you're not going to be running backups, you're not going to be using it for multimedia perhaps, and you can have the system automatically power itself down. And there you go. You might as well have just pulled the LAN cable out the rear, because at this point, it can't be accessed. As long as you've not utilized Wake on LAN, that's it. The system is now powered down and will power back on for you. That removes completely the overnight attack vector, and is now, not only after all of these layers that we've put in, adding two-step authentication, adding blocked or disallowing or allowing only specific IPs to be utilized. You have to use an account that has got a specific level of access to a specific level of writing on a specific shared folder that may or may not have worm to protect it in the first place. You've disabled SSH, you've disabled admin, you've disabled any kind of ability. On top of all of that, minimizing the attack window, you've just cut away half or 2/3 of the day when no one can get in anyway with power on and off schedules. And all of these added up together will significantly minimize any form of access that an exploit, if found, can utilize. And then it's just down to the auto updates to bung a new lock on the door. This has been how to secure your Asustor NAS as robustly as possible next time, when we're going to be talking about in part 7, remote level access, when you are setting up outside access to your system for your home or business needs and doing it in the most secure fashion possible. Stay tuned for that. If you need to learn more or you need further advice, use the NAS Builder or the free advice section over on NAS Compares. Again, we've been through what the NAS Builder can do to help you choose the right NAS for your needs to your own spec, but if you need further support, we've got our Discord, recommended first and third party support servers along with subreddits. You can use the free advice section to get a response within 3 to 5 working days from me and Eddie, or if you're in a rush, use the Expedited service over on Ko-Fi or Patreon. You can even use the Ask.NAS Compares community support forum. If you go to Ko-Fi, not only is there that Expedited support, but you can also join my membership program, which allows you early access to a lot of these videos, as well as exclusive content, monthly Zooms, and that Expedited support on a regular basis. Alternatively, you can hire me or Eddie the Web Guy on a consultation Zoom here, where we can go through your setup with you and help you decide whether your system's as secure as possible. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next part in this series.